The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet that evening, a stark contrast to the usual hum of city life. Officer Michael Johnson's shift was nearing its end, and with exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders, he was ready to call it a night. His patrol car cruised down the damp, narrow roads, its headlights cutting through the misty fog that had settled over the city. Oak Ridge, like most places, held a certain loneliness at night. The sounds of distant voices and the clattering of garbage bins made the darkness feel alive. But tonight, something was different. A faint noise broke the stillness, a sound so small, so weak, that Michael almost dismissed it as the wind rustling through the alleyways. He slowed the car, squinting into the shadows. There it was again. A sound, unmistakable, desperate. A cry, a human cry. Instinct kicked in as he parked the car along the curb, his boots hitting the wet pavement as he stepped out. He drew in a breath, scanning the alley ahead, his flashlight illuminating the trash-strewn path. It was quiet, save for the low hum of the city, the distant rattle of a train, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He moved cautiously, not wanting to make too much noise, yet driven by the pull of the cry that seemed to beckon him forward. The alley was lined with dumpsters, some overturned, some packed to the brim with discarded remnants of the day. Leftover boxes, food containers, and plastic bags. But as he moved deeper into the alley, his light flicked across something unexpected. At first, he thought it was just another piece of discarded trash, but as he drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. There in the corner, half hidden beneath a soggy blanket, lay something he would never have expected to find. A small, helpless infant. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The baby's skin was still covered in the waxy film of birth, the umbilical cord hastily severed, and the blanket that wrapped her was stained with blood and amniotic fluid. She was barely hours old, abandoned like a forgotten piece of refuse. His heart twisted in his chest, his eyes widening with disbelief as he knelt beside the tiny, fragile form. The baby's cries were soft, weak, desperate. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, locking with his. Something deep inside Michael stirred, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, not since he was a child, abandoned and alone, a casualty of life's harshest realities. This baby, this fragile soul, had been left to die in the cold, forgotten, and unloved. For a moment, Michael just stared at her, lost in the enormity of the situation. His hand shook as he gently scooped the baby into his arms, instinctively cradling her close. Her cries softened as she nuzzled against his chest, her tiny fingers wrapping around his calloused thumb with surprising strength. As he held her, a sense of profound responsibility washed over him. In his 15 years of service, Michael had seen the worst of humanity. The violence, the hatred, the indifference. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, for the life he now held in his arms. She was no longer just a baby, a forgotten child left to die in a trash bin. She was a life, fragile and beautiful, full of potential and promise. "Hang in there," he whispered, his voice rough, the words meant for both the baby and himself. "I'm not letting you go." As he stood there in the cold, holding the tiny life that had been discarded like garbage, something inside Michael began to change. He had spent years building walls around his heart, walls forged in the fires of rejection, abandonment, and loss. He'd convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that family was an illusion, something that would only lead to pain. But as he looked down at the newborn in his arms, he realized how wrong he had been. The world could be cruel, yes, but sometimes, in the darkest corners, something beautiful could be found, something worth saving. And as Michael cradled the baby girl, a sense of purpose settled into his soul. He didn't know what the future held, or how things would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this child face the same fate he had. Not if he could help it. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as he carefully wrapped the baby in his jacket. Feeling the weight of the moment, the enormity of the responsibility he had just accepted, his mind raced with questions. What would happen to her now? Who would take care of her? Would she survive the system, or would she be cast aside, like so many others? But for now, the only thing that mattered was the baby in his arms, her soft breaths a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of second chances. The morning after he found the baby was like any other, yet it felt profoundly different. The city of Oak Ridge stirred to life as it always did. The hum of early commuters, the rush of traffic along Main Street, and the soft murmur of vendors setting up their carts. But Michael felt as if he had stepped into a new world, one where everything he had known was now tinted by the events of the night before. He was still trying to process the overwhelming flood of emotions from finding the newborn girl in the trash, but as much as he tried to push it out of his mind, he couldn't. It was there, lingering in the corners of his thoughts, like an itch he couldn't scratch. For the first time in a long while, Michael found himself questioning everything. His entire life had been built around duty, the badge, the uniform, the role of a protector. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to shut out the parts of him that longed for connection. But holding that baby had shattered something inside him. For years, he had avoided intimacy, avoided the idea of family. His own childhood had taught him that love was fleeting, that family was temporary. His parents had died when he was just 12, and after that, he had been bounced from foster home to foster home, each one a reminder that no one would ever truly care for him. The system had failed him, and in turn, he had built walls around his heart, vowing never to let anyone in again. But the baby had undone all of that. She had been abandoned, just like he had. But unlike him, she had no one to fight for her, no one to advocate for her. And as Michael stood in the sterile confines of the Oak Ridge General Hospital, staring down at the tiny bundle wrapped in a clean swaddle, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of protectiveness. He hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the surge of emotions that came with holding a child who had been thrown away. The harsh realities of the world were real, and they had hit him square in the chest. He sat in a plastic chair beside the nursery window, watching the baby sleep. She had been cleaned up, fed, and tucked into a tiny crib, her face peaceful for the moment. For all the chaos that had surrounded her arrival, she seemed so fragile, so innocent. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, and Michael couldn't help but stare at her in awe. She was no longer the helpless, abandoned infant he had found in that trash bin. She was a person who deserved more than the fate that had been handed to her. The nurse came and went, offering kind words, but Michael barely registered them. His thoughts were a whirl of confusion, concern, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. He had seen children in the system before, seen the heartbreak and instability that came with foster care. He had seen kids bounce from one home to the next, never truly feeling loved or wanted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this little girl would be no different unless someone stepped in. When the Child Protective Services officer, Margaret Wheeler, arrived, Michael was still sitting there, his eyes fixed on the baby through the glass. She approached him with a clipboard in hand, her expression both professional and kind, and Michael knew that she was just doing her job. But there was something in the way she looked at him, a quiet skepticism. She didn't say anything at first, just took a seat beside him, her eyes darting to the baby in the crib. "Officer Johnson," she began after a long silence, her voice measured. "You've done your part. You've found her. And now it's up to the system to take over." But Michael's heart twisted as he heard the words. He could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't blame her. After all, why would a single, overworked cop with long hours want to take on the responsibility of a child? But something deep inside him knew that he couldn't just walk away. Not now. "I want to apply as her foster parent," he said, his voice hoarse, as though the words had been stuck in his throat for hours. Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You're a single male," she said slowly, looking down at her clipboard. "With irregular hours, that's not exactly the ideal situation for a child. You know that." "I've got a stable job," Michael responded, his words gaining strength as he spoke. "I have a clean record, And I have a spare bedroom. I found her. That has to count for something." Margaret hesitated, clearly torn. Michael knew what she was thinking. He wasn't the typical foster parent, but for some reason, the pull to care for this child was stronger than anything he had ever felt. There was something about her that spoke to him on a level he couldn't explain. After a long silence, Margaret finally spoke. "I'll help you, but this isn't going to be easy. There will be a lot of paperwork, background checks, and evaluations, and even if you pass, it could take months before you get custody." "I'll do whatever it takes," Michael replied, his voice unwavering. Over the next few days, Michael threw himself into the process, even though he wasn't sure what he was getting into. The system, he quickly learned, was slow, bureaucratic, and full of skepticism. He went through interviews, background checks, psychological evaluations, each one a reminder that he wasn't the ideal candidate for parenthood. But as the days passed, something inside him began to change. The walls he had spent so long building around his heart started to crumble, bit by bit. Patricia Garcia, a veteran cop who had raised 3 children of her own as a single mother, became his unexpected ally. She had seen the same skepticism he had, and she knew how to navigate the system with fierce determination. "They questioned me too," Patricia told him during one of their late-night coffee breaks. "Like being a cop and a parent were mutually exclusive. Like having ovaries gave me some magical parenting abilities that men don't have. It's all nonsense, Johnson. You just have to show them that you can handle it." Patricia helped him prepare for the family court judge, gave him advice on how to set up his apartment for a baby, and even vouched for his character when the court asked. "You're a good man," she told him. "You just need to let them see that." Months passed, and Michael grew more and more invested in the idea of being a father. The house that had once felt empty, the apartment that had been a cold, lonely place, now felt full of potential. He painted the nursery a soft shade of blue, bought a crib, and set up a changing table. It wasn't much, but it was enough. 6 months later, after battling red tape and countless hurdles, Michael was granted temporary custody of the baby, whom he named Emma after his late grandmother. The moment he held her in his arms again, this time officially as her guardian, he felt something inside him snap into place. He was no longer just a police officer. He was a father. And this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But for the first time in years, Michael felt hope. He wasn't just a man carrying out his duty. He was someone's protector, someone's family. And that made all the difference. The early days of parenthood were a blur of exhaustion, surprises, and new discoveries. Michael quickly realized that caring for a baby was nothing like the calm routine of his work. There was no quiet or order. There was only chaos wrapped in a tiny bundle of cries, giggles, and endless needs. But even amid the sleep-deprived haze and the adjustment to having a child in his life, Michael couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that he was doing something important, something that mattered. Emma, as he had named her after his grandmother, was nothing short of a miracle to him. She was tiny, vulnerable, and so utterly dependent on him for everything. He had taken responsibility for her when no one else had. The thought of that moment, the one where he had cradled her from the trash bin into his arms, would never leave his mind. It stayed with him like an anchor, a reminder of the deep bond they had already begun to form, even without words. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb that night, and now, as he changed her diapers or fed her from a bottle, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. But it wasn't easy. The nights were the hardest. When Emma cried in the early hours of the morning, a high-pitched, desperate wail, Michael's heart would race in response. He hadn't anticipated how much he would ache every time she was upset. He had known pain before, had lived through more than his fair share, but this was different. This was a protective instinct, a love he had never fully understood until he became a father. He was no longer a cop with a badge. He was a father who would do anything to ensure his daughter was safe, loved, and protected. The first few months passed in a haze of bottles, pacifiers, and endless rocking. Michael had installed a police scanner in the nursery, a trick he had learned from other officers who juggled family life with the unpredictable hours of the job. It gave him some peace of mind to keep tabs on his precinct while he rocked Emma to sleep. But even with the convenience of technology, Michael struggled with the toll that fatherhood took on his career. His colleagues were supportive, but Captain Brooks had never expected him to turn into the doting, hands-on dad that he had become. Michael was often surprised by the way people in his life reacted to his new role as a father. Most of them were genuinely supportive, but there was an underlying skepticism that he could sense. When he showed up at the precinct with Emma in tow, some of his colleagues would raise their eyebrows, as if surprised to see him as anything other than a stoic officer of the law. Even Captain Brooks, who had always been a father figure of sorts to him, seemed taken aback. "Never thought I'd see you with a baby carrier strapped to your chest, Johnson," he said one day, watching Michael file reports while holding Emma in a sling. "Suits you somehow." Michael wasn't sure what to make of that, but it made him smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he was beginning to fit into something. He was a cop, yes, but he was also more than that now. He was Emma's father. It wasn't always easy, though. Emma, like all babies, went through phases. She had colic for a while, and every night between 2 and 5 a.m., she would cry inconsolably, leaving Michael exhausted and drained. He would pace the floor of the nursery, patting her back gently, trying everything to soothe her. But through the exhaustion, he would always remind himself that it was worth it. Every sleepless night, every struggle, was part of this new life they were building together. One night, after a particularly rough evening of nonstop crying, Michael found himself staring out the window of his apartment, holding Emma against his chest as she finally fell asleep. The city outside was still, the only movement the occasional car passing by. He hadn't realized just how much the world outside had changed for him, how he saw it differently now that he had a child. The same streets he had patrolled for years felt different through the lens of fatherhood. He wasn't just an officer walking the beat anymore. He was a protector of something far more precious. It wasn't just about his career anymore. It wasn't just about doing his job and moving through life on autopilot. For the first time, Michael felt like he had a purpose beyond the badge, a sense of responsibility that went beyond protecting the streets of Oak Ridge. It was about protecting Emma, about giving her the life she deserved, one that he hadn't had. He wanted to be the kind of father that she could rely on, the kind of father who would always be there, no matter what. But there were moments when doubt crept in, when Michael would lie awake late at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was really cut out for this. He was a cop, not a parent. He wasn't sure he had all the answers. He had always been self-reliant, never one to ask for help, but now he found himself feeling vulnerable in ways he hadn't expected. There were days when he doubted his ability to give Emma the life she deserved, days when the weight of fatherhood seemed too much to bear. It was during one of those moments of doubt that Patricia Garcia stepped in again. The seasoned officer who had raised her own children as a single mother knew the struggles Michael was facing. She had seen it all, the balancing act of being a parent and an officer, the late nights, the moments of uncertainty. Over coffee one afternoon, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're doing great, Johnson. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being there every day for her, and you're doing that. Don't forget that." Her words stayed with him, and for the first time in weeks, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe he could do this, that maybe, despite all the obstacles and uncertainty, he was exactly the father Emma needed. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's bond with Emma deepened. She began to smile at him, a tiny toothless grin that melted his heart every time. When she started to crawl, Michael cheered her on, holding out his hands as she inched her way toward him, her baby steps so tentative but filled with determination. He marveled at her growth, at the way she was slowly but surely becoming her own person. But it wasn't just about the milestones. Emma was changing Michael too. She had a way of drawing him out of himself, of forcing him to confront the parts of him he had long buried. Being her father made him realize that there was more to life than the job, more to life than the armor he had built around himself for so long. She showed him a new side of himself, a side that was capable of unconditional love, of sacrifice, and of nurturing. One evening, as he rocked Emma to sleep, Michael looked down at her soft, peaceful face, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time in a long time, he could see a future, one where he wasn't alone, one where he was building something real and lasting with his daughter. And that future, he realized, was worth fighting for. The months that followed brought subtle yet profound changes to Michael's life. He had settled into a routine, but it wasn't just any routine. It was a new life he was living, a life filled with meaning and responsibility. His connection with Emma had deepened, and so had his commitment to being a father. No longer just an officer who clocked in and out, Michael had become the protector of this tiny, fragile being who relied on him for everything. In the late-night feedings, the teething troubles, and even the quiet moments of watching her sleep, he discovered a depth of love he hadn't known he was capable of. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments of uncertainty, moments when the weight of being a single parent seemed almost too much to bear. Michael had always been the type to keep his feelings close, to soldier on through challenges without much outward display. But raising Emma was different. Raising her meant opening up to vulnerability, not just with her but with others. He had to admit when he didn't have all the answers, and for someone who had lived most of his life pretending to have it all together, that was a hard pill to swallow. One evening, as he sat with Emma on his lap, his thoughts wandered back to the night he found her, the moment when everything changed. The baby in his arms had gone from being a helpless infant to a lively toddler with her own personality. Emma had developed a mischievous streak, always getting into things she shouldn't, testing limits in ways that made Michael laugh and pulled his hair out at the same time. She had a habit of getting into his police gear, especially his badge. There had been more than one occasion where he'd found her standing on a chair, trying to fasten the heavy badge to her chest, her tiny face scrunched up in concentration. It made him chuckle, but it also made him realize that she was growing up too fast. She would be running circles around him before he knew it. That thought lingered in his mind as he gazed out the window of his small apartment. The city outside seemed the same as ever, the same streets he had patrolled countless times. But for Michael, everything had changed. He wasn't just an officer walking those streets anymore. He was a father who would do anything to ensure his daughter's safety, her happiness, her future. It wasn't just Emma's presence that had changed him. It was the realization that the world had more to offer than the confines of his badge. Michael had always been a dedicated cop, yes, but now he saw the job through a different lens. It wasn't just about catching criminals or solving cases. It was about the people, the families, he was protecting. It was about making sure that children like Emma would never face the kind of neglect and abandonment that she had suffered. He couldn't change the world, but he could change their little corner of it, and that was enough. The early morning calls for shifts, the late nights responding to incidents, the constant hum of the radio. Michael didn't mind it as much anymore. He was still the same cop who showed up every day, but now he had something to come home to, something that mattered far more than the job. And when the calls got too much, when the stress of balancing both fatherhood and policing felt overwhelming, he thought of Emma, her wide eyes looking up at him with trust and affection, and he knew that he had to keep going for her. There were days when he had to remind himself that he wasn't in this alone. His team at the Oak Ridge Police Department had been supportive, especially Captain Brooks. The tough, no-nonsense leader had initially doubted whether Michael could juggle fatherhood and policing, but over time, he saw the dedication Michael had to both roles. "You're handling it better than I thought you would, Johnson," Brooks said one morning as he saw Michael filing reports with Emma perched in a carrier on his chest. It was one of those rare moments when Michael allowed himself to accept the praise, even if just for a second. His heart swelled with pride, not because of the recognition, but because he had proved to himself that he could do this. But it wasn't just his colleagues who noticed. In Oak Ridge, where everyone knew everyone's business, word had spread that Michael had become a father, and people were watching. Some people whispered their doubts, unsure of a single police officer taking on such a responsibility, while others admired his courage. There were even moments when people from the community would stop him on the street, complimenting him on his new life and offering words of encouragement. He had never been the kind of person to draw attention to himself, but now, as a father, it felt different. He was no longer just Michael Johnson, the cop. He was a father who had taken in a child no one else wanted, and that, he realized, had become his greatest achievement. Then came the days when Emma started to speak her first words. The first time she said, "Dada," was a moment Michael would never forget. It wasn't just the word itself, but the way it made him feel. That one syllable, spoken in her baby voice, was a confirmation that he was doing something right, that all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, and all the doubts were leading to something incredible. It wasn't just a job. This was his life now, and it was more than he could have ever imagined. As Emma grew, so did Michael's commitment to her. Every decision he made was filtered through the lens of fatherhood. Whether it was picking her up from daycare, attending her first ballet recital, or simply making sure she had a healthy breakfast every morning, Michael had become fully immersed in his role as her father. And with each passing day, he realized just how much of a difference one child could make in his life. Emma wasn't just a baby he had found abandoned in a trash bin. She was a part of him, and in her, he saw the promise of a future that was now filled with hope. But even as things seemed to be going well, Michael couldn't escape the shadows of his past. He had learned to bury his own pain, his abandonment as a child, and the heartbreak of his failed relationship with Catherine. But some things had a way of resurfacing when he least expected it. As Emma grew older, Michael found himself wondering about her biological parents, the people who had abandoned her in the trash. He tried to push the thoughts away, knowing that Emma was his daughter now. But the questions lingered. What kind of people could leave their child like that? Did they even care? Did they ever think about her? One afternoon, while Emma napped, Michael sat in his small living room, flipping through old police files. He came across the case file from the night he found Emma. It was a procedural report, one he had filled out after discovering the baby in the trash. He had never really read it after that night. It had just been a case, a tragic moment in time. But as he read through the details again, something struck him. There was more to this story, more than he had initially realized. Someone had left this child behind, yes, but someone else had cared enough to take the time to hide her, to keep her safe from the elements, even if only for a few hours. Michael found himself staring at the file for a long time, wondering if, somewhere out there, there were answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. In that moment, Michael realized something powerful. Emma had changed his life, but the journey to truly understanding her, who she was, where she came from, was just beginning. And no matter where that journey led, Michael was ready to face it head-on, because for the first time, he wasn't just doing it for a badge or a job. He was doing it for his daughter. And that, he knew, made all the difference. As the years passed, Michael's life became intricately woven into Emma's, each day bringing new challenges and joys. He had learned to navigate the delicate balance of being a police officer and a full-time parent. At first, he had been unsure how to combine his demanding career with fatherhood, but somehow he had found a rhythm. His days were filled with calls, paperwork, and investigations, but his nights were dedicated to Emma. When she asked him to read the same book for the 100th time, or when she needed help tying her shoes, Michael was there, as present as he could be. Through all the ups and downs, Michael had made sure that Emma never felt alone. He gave her everything he had: love, stability, and protection. He had learned the hard way that life wasn't perfect, that it was full of setbacks, heartaches, and unexpected challenges. But he also knew now that those moments didn't define a person. What defined him, what defined their family, was how they faced those challenges together. Michael had continued to work long shifts at the precinct, often coming home late at night to find Emma waiting for him. She had grown into a bright and curious young girl, always asking questions and soaking up everything around her. Sometimes, when he tucked her into bed, Michael would wonder what her life would have been like if he hadn't found her that rainy night. Would she have ended up in foster care, shuffled from one temporary home to another, her potential buried under a system too overburdened to give her the attention she deserved? It was a thought he couldn't bear to entertain, but it lingered in the back of his mind. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Emma was thriving, and Michael had built a life for them, both in Oak Ridge. But deep down, Michael knew that there was something missing. Emma had grown into a lively, intelligent child, but there was still that nagging question that Michael couldn't shake. Who were her biological parents, and why had they abandoned her in such a cruel way? The questions had haunted Michael since the day he found Emma. He had tried to bury them, convincing himself that it didn't matter. After all, Emma was his daughter now. He loved her, and that was enough. But as Emma grew older, it became harder to ignore the deep sense of curiosity and need for closure that simmered inside him. One day, while Michael was on a break at work, he received a call that would change everything. It was from an investigator with the Oak Ridge Police Department, someone he didn't know very well. The investigator, a woman named Julia Harris, explained that they had recently come across new information regarding the case of the abandoned baby. "We've been digging into the circumstances surrounding the day you found her, Officer Johnson," Julia said, "and I think we may have uncovered something you should know." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected the case to resurface, but now that it had, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. He agreed to meet Julia at the precinct, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived, Julia briefed him on the details. They had managed to track down a woman who had been in the area the night Emma had been abandoned. The woman had seen a car pull up near the alley behind Mario's pizzeria, and had noticed a figure hurriedly leaving the area. After some investigation, the woman had recognized the person as a former resident of Oak Ridge, a woman who had disappeared several years ago without a trace. Her name was Karen Foster. Michael's mind raced as he listened. Karen Foster had been known around Oak Ridge as someone who had fallen on hard times. She had been homeless, living in and out of shelters, struggling with addiction. But what Julia revealed next sent a shock through Michael's chest. Karen Foster, Julia continued, was believed to have had a child a few months before she vanished. And based on what we've uncovered, we think that child may be Emma. The room seemed to close in on Michael as the words sank in. Could Emma really be the daughter of a woman like Karen Foster? The thought was almost too much to process. Michael had always wondered who had left Emma in that trash bin, but he had never imagined this possibility. He had known that Emma had been abandoned, but to think that her biological mother had been a part of the city's underground, struggling with addiction and homelessness, it shattered everything Michael thought he knew about her past. Julia went on to explain that they had discovered Karen Foster's whereabouts. She had been living in a nearby town, trying to rebuild her life after years of instability. She had recently gotten clean and had reached out to the authorities, desperate to make amends for her past mistakes. It turned out that Karen had been trying to find her daughter, but she had never known where Emma had gone after the night of her abandonment. Michael's heart was in turmoil. On the one hand, he knew that Emma deserved to know the truth about her origins, but on the other hand, the thought of Emma being reunited with the woman who had left her in a trash bin was a gut-wrenching thought. What kind of relationship could Emma have with a mother who had made such a reckless decision? Could Karen ever truly make up for what she had done? After some thought, Michael agreed to meet with Karen. He knew that, for Emma's sake, he had to give her the chance to learn about her past. But the decision wasn't easy. He had spent the last several years as Emma's father, and he had never once questioned his place in her life. Now, He was being forced to confront the very thing he had been running from. The fact that Emma had another parent, one who had abandoned her, and one who may want to be a part of her future. The meeting was set for the following week, and as the day approached, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for. He had always tried to protect Emma from the pain of her past, but now he had to navigate a complicated truth that he wasn't sure Emma was ready for. When the day finally came, Michael stood outside the modest house where Karen Foster was living, his stomach tied in knots. He had no idea what to expect from this encounter, but one thing was certain. Everything he had built for Emma could be at risk. The child he had come to know and love so fiercely might be about to confront a part of her past that could change her forever. As he knocked on the door, Michael's mind raced with 1,000 questions. Would Karen be the mother that Emma needed? Or would she prove to be the person who had abandoned her when she needed someone the most? It was a question that Michael couldn't answer. All he knew was that, no matter what happened, he had to protect Emma. He had to do whatever it took to ensure that she was safe, and that her future, no matter how complicated, was one she could navigate with love, support, and security. The door opened, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. There, standing before him, was Karen Foster, the woman who had given birth to the child he had come to think of as his own. As the door creaked open, Michael's gaze met Karen Foster's, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. She was older than he expected, her face lined with the years of hardship she'd endured. Her hair was unkempt, and her eyes carried a weight of regret, as though they were windows into a past she couldn't escape. The silence between them was thick, and neither spoke for a long moment, as if both were waiting for the other to break the tension. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice quiet but laced with emotion. "Are you Michael Johnson, the officer who found my daughter?" Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I am. And you must be Karen." She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Please come in. I've been waiting for this day for so long, but now that it's here, I don't know what to say. I'm not sure if I'm ready." Michael hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the vulnerability in Karen's voice was not something he had anticipated. Slowly, he stepped into the house, which, though modest, was tidy. It had the feeling of someone trying to rebuild, piece by piece. There was a photo of a young girl on the mantel, Emma, undoubtedly, though the picture was one he had never seen before. Karen led him to the living room, and they both sat down on the worn but comfortable sofa. There was a small table between them, and for a moment, both stared at it, unsure how to begin the conversation. Karen broke the silence again, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you've told her about me, Michael, but I've never stopped thinking about her. I've never stopped wondering where she was, if she was okay, if she was happy." Michael swallowed, his emotions battling for control. He had always wanted to know more about Emma's biological mother, but now that he was face to face with her, the questions he had once carried felt far less significant. What mattered now was how this conversation would shape Emma's future, and his own. "She doesn't know much," Michael finally said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of sadness. "I've always been her father, Karen. I've loved her and raised her as my own. She's my world." Karen's eyes welled up with tears. She quickly wiped them away, but it didn't stop the flood from coming. "I never meant to hurt her," she whispered. "I was broken when I had her. I was lost. I didn't know how to care for her, and I didn't know how to care for myself. I couldn't give her what she deserved." Michael looked at her, his heart heavy with empathy. He understood the pain of abandonment all too well. He knew the sting of being rejected, of being left behind by the very people who were supposed to love you. But what he didn't understand was how someone could abandon their own child in such a way, without looking back, without a shred of remorse. "I've been clean for 3 years now," Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've been working hard to make amends, to fix the mess I made of my life. But I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I failed her, and I failed myself. I don't expect her to forgive me. I don't expect anything from her. I just want her to know the truth, Michael. I want her to know that I love her, and I never wanted to hurt her." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been preparing for this moment for so long, but now that it was happening, it was harder than he had ever imagined. "I'm not sure how she'll feel about meeting you," he said carefully. "She's had a good life with me, Karen. A stable one. But she deserves to know her past, even if it's painful." Karen looked down at her hands, the guilt written all over her face. "I understand," she said softly. "I never wanted to disrupt her life, Michael, but she deserves the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear." The silence between them grew once again, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Michael wondered how Emma would react when he told her about this meeting. Would she be angry with him for keeping the truth from her? Would she be curious to meet the woman who had given her life, but had also abandoned her in her earliest moments? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to be honest with Emma, no matter how difficult it would be. She was at an age now where the world was becoming more complex for her. She was asking bigger questions, searching for deeper truths. And one day, she would need to know the truth about her mother. The questions she would have, the doubts and the pain, would all come flooding in, whether he was ready for them or not. Before Michael could say anything more, Karen stood up, her hand shaking as she reached for a small box on the shelf. She opened it slowly and placed it on the table between them. "This is for her," she said quietly. "It's all I have. Some old pictures, some things I kept, things I couldn't throw away. I don't expect her to take them, but I want her to know that I thought about her every single day." Michael stared at the box for a moment before picking it up. It was small, delicate, and held a kind of weight that only a mother's love could carry. Inside were old photographs of a young Karen, and a few of Emma as an infant, their faces so similar, it was hard to deny the connection. There were a few trinkets, small, handmade items that spoke of a life that had once been filled with hope, before it was drowned in addiction and despair. "I'll give this to her," Michael said softly. "But I think it's going to take some time, Karen. She's young, and this is a lot for her to process." Karen nodded. "I understand. I don't expect anything from her. I just want her to know that I love her." They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. The conversation had been more difficult than either of them had anticipated, but it had also been necessary. The truth had to come out, even if it came with pain and uncertainty. For Emma's sake, it had to be told. As Michael stood to leave, he looked at Karen one last time. She seemed smaller now, less the woman who had abandoned her child, and more like a person trying to make peace with her past. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing. Emma's life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. He stepped out of the house, the small box of memories in his hand, and the weight of the world on his shoulders. The journey ahead would be hard, but he was determined to help Emma navigate it with grace, with love, and with the unshakable truth that, no matter what, she was his daughter, and always would be. As he drove back to his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message from Emma, asking when he would be home. A simple question, but one that brought him back to the present, to the little girl waiting for him. The truth was heavy, but it wasn't everything. What mattered most was the love he had for her, and the love she had for him. And that, Michael knew, was something no one could ever take away.